I commit myself to serve you all, King, country, and Commonwealth. God save the King.
One signature, one sealed document, one decision the Queen made years before anyone knew she was dying. William just took control of an estate so private it doesn't appear in any public royal record. And Camilla, she found out the same way she finds out about everything that William does. Lass. The estate. Nobody knew existed. How does a royal estate worth hundreds of millions of pounds disappear from every public record? Every land registry filing, every official inventory of crown property for over 70 years? The answer is simple. Someone very powerful decided it should, and that someone was Queen Elizabeth II. The estate at the center of this story doesn't have a famous name. It has never appeared in a royal documentary. No photographer has ever been granted access to its grounds. No journalist has ever filed a report from its gates. For the better part of 8 decades, its existence was known only to a tiny circle of senior courtiers, royal legal advisors, and the monarch herself. It sits in a stretch of English countryside so deliberately unremarkable from the road that you could drive past it 100 times and never once suspect what lies behind its tree line. That invisibility was not accidental. It was engineered. And understanding why it was engineered is the only way to understand what William taking control of it actually means. Because this is not simply a story about land or money or inheritance. It is a story about power, about who the Queen trusted with her most private legacy, and about a decision she made quietly, carefully, and completely alone, years before the world knew her health was failing. Let's go back to the beginning. In the years following the Second World War, the British royal family was navigating a very particular kind of vulnerability. The war had changed everything. The empire was contracting. The public's relationship with the monarchy was shifting. And the institution, for all its ceremonial grandeur, was privately aware that its future depended on something more durable than tradition. It depended on continuity, on having structures, assets, and resources that existed outside the reach of government, outside the fluctuations of public opinion, and outside the visibility of a press that was becoming more intrusive with every passing decade. It was in that context that the estate was quietly established, not purchased through any official royal channel, not listed under the Crown Estate or the Duchy of Cornwall, acquired privately, structured legally through a mechanism that placed it outside the standard frameworks of royal property ownership, and then essentially made to vanish from the public record with them a kind of institutional thoroughness that only a monarchy with centuries of practice at discretion can manage. For decades, it sat there, maintained, protected, visited privately by the Queen on occasions that were never announced and never photographed, a place that existed, sources say, not as a retreat in the conventional sense, but as something closer to a vault. Think about that word, a vault. Because what the estate contains is not simply land and buildings, though the land is substantial and the buildings are extraordinary in their own quiet way. What it contains is history, private, unfiltered, institutionally significant history, documents, correspondence, objects, materials that the Queen spent decades deciding should be preserved not within the formal royal archives, which are subject to various forms of access and scrutiny, but somewhere entirely off the grid, somewhere that would only pass to someone she trusted completely. Now, here is where the story takes its first significant turn. Because Queen Elizabeth did not arrive at her decision about who should inherit this estate quickly or casually, sources familiar with the internal history of the property describe a process that unfolded over many years, a gradual, deliberate assessment of which member of the family had the character, the discretion, and the understanding of institutional responsibility to be trusted with something this significant. She watched her children, she watched her grandchildren, she made her assessment. And at some point in the mid-2010s, she began bringing William to the estate, not for ceremonial visits, not for photo opportunities or public appearances, privately. The two of them, sometimes with a single trusted aide, walking the grounds, sitting in the old rooms, reviewing materials that have never been described in any public document. People familiar with these visits describe them as profoundly purposeful. The Queen was not showing William a property. She was showing him a responsibility. She was walking him through the physical embodiment of everything she believed a monarch needed to understand about the private architecture of the crown. She was preparing him, and William, by every account, understood exactly what was being communicated. He did not treat these visits as a privilege, he treated them as a tutorial. Sources say he asked questions, detailed questions, about the history of specific documents, about the reasoning behind particular acquisitions, about the legal structures that protected the estate from public exposure. He took notes. He returned multiple times. He engaged with the material in a way that went far beyond what simple curiosity would have required. He was learning to be its custodian before he was ever formally told it would be his. That detail matters enormously, because it tells you that the Queen's decision to leave this estate to William was not a late addition to her final arrangements. It was not something decided in the rush of declining health or the urgency of final paperwork. It was a considered, years-long, deeply intentional choice. By the time she formally structured the legal transfer, she had already spent years confirming in her own mind that the choice was right. Now, pause here for a moment, because there is something in this picture that should be making you ask a very specific question. If the Queen spent years preparing William for this inheritance, years walking him through the estate, years essentially signaling her intentions through action rather than words, who else was watching? Who else in that family was paying attention? Who else understood, even without being told directly, that something significant was being built between the Queen and her grandson? The answer to that question is the reason Camilla's fury, when it finally came, was so volcanic. Because she had seen the visits, she had registered the pattern, and she had chosen to believe, perhaps because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with, that the relationship between the Queen and William was simply the natural warmth between a grandmother and her eldest grandson. She had not allowed herself to understand that it was something far more deliberate than that. By the time the legal documents were activated and the transfer was confirmed, Camilla had lost not just an estate, she had lost a game she had not fully realized she was playing. And the Queen had won it from beyond the grave. Stay with us. Because what was actually inside those legal documents, and how the transfer was structured to be completely and permanently irreversible, is the part of this story that changes everything. What William inherited and how. On the 3rd of February 2026, a 2-paragraph statement moved quietly through the internal channels of Buckingham Palace. It did not go to the press first. It did not appear on any official royal website. It was not announced at a briefing or confirmed through the usual choreography of royal communications. It moved the way the most significant things inside this institution always move, silently, through the right hands, in the right order, with maximum control over who knew what and when. By the time it reached the people it was always going to reach last, the damage was already done. But let's back up, because to understand the full weight of what that statement confirmed, you need to understand the legal structure that made this transfer not just possible, but completely unassailable. The estate did not pass to William through a conventional will. That is the first thing to understand. A conventional will, even a royal one, exists within a framework that carries certain vulnerabilities. It can be contested. It can be subject to interpretation. It can become the subject of legal challenges from parties who believe they have a competing claim. The Queen understood this, and the Queen, who had spent 7 decades watching this institution navigate exactly the kind of internal disputes that conventional inheritance frameworks invite, had no intention of leaving this particular transfer exposed to any of that. So, she did something different. In 2020, 2 years before her death, and at a point when her health concerns were not yet publicly known, she instructed her personal legal team to construct what sources describe as a covenant trust, a private legal mechanism filed under a charter seal that placed the estate in a category of its own. Outside the Crown estate, outside the Duchy of Cornwall, outside every standard framework of royal property succession. Think about the precision of that timing. 2020, the world was consumed by a global pandemic. Every institution on Earth was dealing with disruption and uncertainty. And quietly, with no announcement, no public record, and no indication to anyone outside her most trusted legal circle, the Queen was building an airtight legal fortress around her most private asset, and naming her grandson as its sole beneficiary. The covenant trust came with specific conditions. It was not a simple transfer of ownership. It was a transfer of guardianship, a distinction the legal documents were apparently very deliberate about. William was not simply inheriting property, he was inheriting a responsibility. The trust specified that the estate could not be commercially developed. It could not be rebranded. It could not be opened to outside investors or incorporated into any venture, public or private, that was not directly approved by William himself. Every clause pointed in the same direction. This estate was to remain exactly what the Queen had always kept it as: private, protected, insulated from the commercial ambitions and the institutional politics that she had watched consume so much of the royal family's energy and credibility over the decades of her reign. And then there was the activation clause. This is the detail that sources describe as the most remarkable element of the entire legal structure. The covenant trust was not designed to activate automatically upon the Queen's death. It was designed to activate upon the satisfaction of two specific conditions. The first condition was the conclusion of the Queen's state funeral. The second condition was the formal public recognition of William as heir to institutional responsibility. Both conditions had to be met before the transfer became legally effective. The Queen was not simply leaving William an estate. She was timing the transfer to a moment when his position within the institution was publicly and formally established beyond any possible challenge. She was not leaving anything to chance. What the trust transferred to William when it finally activated was staggering in its scope. The land itself is substantial. Several hundred acres of private English countryside that has never appeared on any public map of royal holdings. The buildings include a primary residence of significant historical character, multiple outbuildings, a private chapel, and archival facilities that sources describe as purpose-built for the preservation of sensitive materials. And then there is the contents. Because the physical estate is only part of what William inherited, the trust also transferred custodianship of everything inside it. Private correspondence spanning decades, documents that have never been cataloged in any public royal archive, materials that, sources suggest, touch on decisions and events in the private history of the monarchy that the official record has never fully reflected. Let that sit for a moment. William did not just inherit land. He inherited the Queen's private version of history, her unfiltered, unmanaged, institutionally unmediated account of what actually happened inside this family and this institution across the decades of her reign. That is an extraordinary thing to pass to one person. And the fact that she passed it to William rather than to Charles, rather than to any of her other children or grandchildren, is a statement so loud that it barely needs interpretation. Now, here is where the story gets even more layered, because the activation of the trust in February 2026 did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of a palace that was already managing multiple significant pressures simultaneously. King Charles's health situation, the ongoing fallout from Prince Andrew's legal difficulties, the broader public conversation about the monarchy's future direction. William had been increasingly central to managing all of those pressures, and the activation of the Covenant Trust, arriving in that specific moment, sent a signal to everyone inside the institution who understood what it meant. The Queen had already decided, years before any of this was visible, that William was the person the crown's future depended on. She had encoded that decision in a legal document designed to be permanently irreversible. Charles was still king, but the Queen's most private legacy had gone to his son. Think about what that means for a moment. Not constitutionally. Constitutionally, the line of succession is unchanged. Charles is king and William is heir. That structure is untouched. But dynastically, in the deeper sense of which person the Queen trusted with the most intimate and significant materials of her reign, the answer was unambiguous. It was not Charles, it was William. Sources close to the palace describe the internal reaction to the trust activation as controlled on the surface and considerably less controlled underneath. Senior courtiers who had known about the trust's existence were not surprised by its activation. They had been waiting for it. But even those who knew it was coming described the moment of formal confirmation as carrying a weight that went beyond the legal and financial details. It felt, one source said, like the Queen speaking. Like a final clear statement from a woman who had spent her entire life saying very little directly and communicating everything through action. Now, here's the question I want you to hold on to as we move into the next part of this story. If the trust was structured this carefully, if every clause was designed with this level of precision, if the timing was calibrated this deliberately, then the Queen knew something else too. She knew who would be unhappy about it, she knew who had been watching the estate, she knew who had been forming plans around it, and she structured the legal transfer to make those plans completely impossible anyway. That was not accidental. That was a message. And Camilla, when she finally understood the full scope of what had just happened, received that message with a clarity that sources describe as absolutely devastating. What she had been planning, what her son Tom had already put in motion. And the precise moment she understood it was all finished before it ever began. That is what comes next. Camilla's fury and what she stood to lose. Let's be precise about something before we go any further. Camilla is not a passive figure inside this institution. She never has been. The public image, warm, slightly self-deprecating, the grandmother who loves dogs and books and country walks, is real enough on its surface. But underneath it is a woman who understands power with the same instinctive clarity that she understands everything else about this family. She knows how the institution works. She knows which assets matter and which ones are ceremonial. She knows the difference between a title and actual leverage. And she knows that inside the British royal family, land is never just land. Land is history. Land is authority. Land is the physical expression of dynastic permanence. So, when Camilla began paying attention to the estate at the center of this story, she was not doing so casually. She was doing so strategically. Sources with knowledge of the internal palace dynamics from 2023 onward describe a pattern that, in retrospect, is extremely revealing. Camilla had begun making quiet inquiries about properties that sat outside the standard Crown estate framework, not through official channels, not through formal requests that would generate paperwork and create a record, through conversations, through the kind of soft, exploratory probing that leaves no trace but covers a great deal of ground. She was mapping the terrain, and the estate that William would eventually inherit was very much on her map. Now, here is where her son Tom enters the picture. Tom Parker Bowles is a food writer and journalist of genuine talent. He has built a real career on his own terms and deserves credit for that. But sources close to the palace describe a version of Tom that exists alongside the public one. A Tom who is acutely aware of his proximity to one of the most asset-rich families in the world. A Tom who has, on more than one occasion, allowed that awareness to shape his ambitions in directions that go considerably beyond food writing. By late 2024, Tom had developed a vision for the estate that he and Camilla had been quietly circling. The vision was detailed, it was commercially sophisticated, and it was, in the language of the documents that sources describe, dressed very carefully in the clothing of heritage and public service, while being driven by something considerably more commercial underneath. The plan centered on what Tom apparently called a living royal legacy experience. On the surface, it sounded respectful, a carefully curated visitor experience celebrating the private history of the monarchy. Educational programming, conservation work on the grounds, partnerships with cultural institutions, the kind of proposal that wraps commercial ambition in enough public benefit language to make it difficult to argue against directly. But underneath the surface language, the financial architecture told a different story. Sources describe a business model that included premium private membership tiers for what the documents apparently called guardian families. Individuals and couples who would pay significant annual fees for exclusive access to the estate's grounds, its private chapel, and curated historical materials. The fees being discussed, according to sources familiar with the planning documents, started at figures that would make most people's eyes water. Then there was the hospitality component. Tom had been in conversation with a small number of luxury hospitality investors about the possibility of converting portions of the estate's outbuildings into an ultra-exclusive retreat, not a hotel in the conventional sense, something smaller, more rarefied, more expensive. The kind of establishment that markets itself on the basis of access to something genuinely unique. And what could be more unique than a private royal estate that the public had never known existed? That was the commercial logic. And as commercial logic goes, it was not unsophisticated. There was also a media dimension. Sources describe conversations between Tom and production companies about a documentary series built around the estate's history. The kind of prestige documentary that would have positioned Tom as the guide, the interpreter, the man with the key to a door the world had never seen opened. The commercial value of that positioning, both for the production itself and for Tom's broader public profile, was significant. Camilla had been supportive of the vision, more than supportive. Sources describe her as an active participant in its development. She had used her access, her relationships within the palace, and her position as queen consort to create the conditions in which Tom's plans might eventually become viable. Not by making formal requests that could be formally refused, by shaping the environment, by keeping certain conversations open and certain doors unlocked. It was, in the way that Camilla tends to operate, effective without being visible. And then, February 3rd, 2026 arrived. The Covenant Trust activated, the transfer was confirmed, and everything Camilla and Tom had been building, every conversation, every planning document, every quietly cultivated relationship with investors and producers and heritage consultants became worthless in a single morning. Sources describe the moment Camilla was informed of the transfer's activation as one of the most charged moments inside the palace in recent memory. She was not informed by William. She was not informed by Charles, who sources indicate had known about the trust's existence but had not fully communicated its scope to his wife. She was informed by a senior courtier delivering a briefing document that landed on her desk with the particular weight of something that had already happened and could not be undone. She read it. She read it again. And then, according to sources present in the building that morning, she said nothing for a very long time. The silence was not calm. People who know Camilla well describe her silences as weather systems. This one, sources say, was the kind that precedes something significant. What followed in the hours and days after the confirmation was a sequence of events that sources describe carefully and consistently. Camilla contacted her legal team, not to contest the transfer, because the Covenant Trust had been structured with sufficient precision to make any legal challenge effectively pointless from the outset, but to understand, with complete clarity, exactly what had been closed off and whether any thread anywhere in the legal structure offered any possibility of revision. There was no thread. The Queen had seen to that personally. Tom's reaction was less contained. Sources describe a man who had invested significant time, energy, and a considerable amount of personal credibility with investors and production partners in a project that had now been rendered impossible. The conversations he would have to have, the explanations he would have to give, the quiet unwinding of plans that had been presented to certain people as considerably more advanced than they perhaps should have been. One source described his position with devastating simplicity. He had been selling tickets to a house that was never going to be his. The fury that followed inside Camilla's circle was real, and it was sustained. Sources describe a period of several weeks in which the temperature around her was notably different from its usual register. Interactions that would normally be warm were clipped. Decisions that would normally be made collaboratively were made unilaterally. The careful managed composure that Camilla presents to the world was present in public. In private, it was considerably thinner. She made one attempt to raise the matter directly, not with William. Going to William directly would have conceded a dynamic that Camilla was not prepared to concede, and she went to Charles. A private conversation, the details of which sources are protective of, in which she apparently made the case that the transfer had been structured in a way that was unnecessarily excluding to members of the family who had legitimate interest in the estate's future. Charles listened. He was sympathetic in the way that Charles tends to be sympathetic, warm in tone, attentive in manner, and ultimately immovable on the substance, because Charles knew something that Camilla was still working through emotionally. The Queen had not made a mistake. She had not excluded Camilla accidentally or through an oversight that could be revisited. She had made a deliberate choice encoded in an irreversible legal structure that reflected her settled view of who should be trusted with her most private legacy. Arguing against that was not arguing against William. It was arguing against Elizabeth. And Charles, whatever his complicated feelings about the specific outcome, was not prepared to position himself as someone who contested his mother's final and most deliberate wishes. He told Camilla, in terms that sources describe as gentle but final, that the matter was settled. She left that conversation understanding something she may have suspected for a long time, but had never been forced to confront so directly. The The Queen had watched her, had assessed her, had made a judgment. And the judgment, communicated not in words but in the legally precise language of a covenant trust that excluded her completely, was not flattering. That understanding, sources say, sits underneath everything else. Underneath the fury about the Ballsdeck commercial opportunity, underneath the frustration about Tom's collapsed plans, underneath the anger at the timing and the manner of the confirmation, the deepest wound is not what Camilla lost. It is what the Queen's decision revealed about what Elizabeth truly thought of her. And that is not something that any subsequent development, any future gesture, any amount of time can fully resolve, because the Queen is gone. And the document she left behind says everything she never said out loud. What this means for the monarchy. Pull back from the personal drama for a moment. Pull back from Camilla's fury and Tom's collapsed plans and the legal precision of the covenant trust. Pull back from the private conversations and the charged silences and the meetings that ended without resolution. Pull back from all of it and look at the bigger picture. Because what is happening here is not simply a family dispute over property. It is a monarchy in the process of deciding what it is going to be. And the Queen's decision to transfer this estate to William, structured the way it was structured, timed the way it was timed, is one of the clearest signals anyone inside or outside this institution has seen in years about the direction that future is taking. Princess Anne. Because Anne's role in this story has been deliberately understated so far, and it deserves its own examination. Sources familiar with the internal timeline of the trust activation describe Anne as one of a very small number of people who knew about the Covenant Trust before it became public. Not because she was told formally, because Anne, who has spent her entire life inside this institution with her eyes open and her mouth closed, had understood what was being built between the Queen and William long before any legal document made it official. She had watched the visits, she had registered the pattern, and she had said nothing. Not because she was indifferent, but because she agreed with the conclusion her mother was quietly reaching. Anne has never had illusions about the complexity of the people her brother, Charles, chose to bring into this family. She has never performed warmth she did not feel, or expressed confidence she did not have. And her silence throughout the years of the Queen's private preparation of William was not passive, it was a form of consent. When the trust activated in February 2026, Anne was one of the first people William contacted, not to inform her, to acknowledge her, because William understood, with the emotional intelligence that has consistently surprised people who underestimated him, that Anne had been a quiet guardian of this process for years. Sources describe their conversation as brief and characteristically unsentimental. Anne told him simply to honor it, not the estate, not the legal structure, the intention behind it. The Queen's vision of what the monarchy needed to become, and who needed to lead it there. William understood exactly what she meant. Now let's talk about Catherine, because Catherine's role in what comes next is as significant as anyone else's in this story, and it is not being discussed anywhere near enough. When William takes full control of the estate and begins the process of determining how its resources and materials will be used going forward, Catherine will be beside him in the way she is always beside him, not ceremonially, strategically. Sources close to the couple describe a shared vision for the estate that is entirely consistent with the Queen's original intentions. No commercial development, no outside investors, no rebranding or hospitality ventures or documentary series. The estate will remain what it has always been, private, protected, a resource for the institution rather than a product to be sold to the highest bidder. But within that framework, Catherine has her own ideas about how its historical materials might eventually serve a purpose beyond pure preservation. Sources describe conversations about scholarship, about making certain materials available to serious historians under controlled conditions that protect the institution while contributing to a genuine understanding of modern royal history. It is, characteristically, a position that manages to be both conservative and forward-thinking simultaneously. That combination is Catherine's signature, and it is precisely why William trusts her judgment on something this significant. Now, zoom out further, because the transfer of this estate to William is happening in a context that makes it more significant than it would be in ordinary times. Charles is the king. He is managing his health with the discipline and dignity that has characterized everything about his reign. But the reality inside the palace, the reality that everyone who works there understands and that the public is only beginning to perceive, is that the center of gravity is shifting. William is not waiting to be king. He is already functioning as the institutional anchor of the monarchy in ways that go beyond his formal role as heir. The decisions being made about the Andrew situation, the management of the family's public reputation, the direction of the crown's relationship with the British public. These are areas where William's influence is no longer advisory, it is primary, and the Covenant trust arriving at this specific moment is not separate from that reality. It is an expression of it. The Queen built a legal structure that would transfer her most private legacy to William at exactly the moment his institutional authority was becoming undeniable. The timing was not coincidental. It was the final piece of a design she had been working on for years. Think about what Elizabeth II actually did here. She watched her family for decades. She watched her children navigate their marriages and their scandals and their complicated relationships with the institution she had given her life to protecting. She watched a new generation emerge. She assessed them with the same cool precision she brought to every other significant decision of her reign. And then she acted. Not with drama, not with public statements or formal declarations. With a legal document filed quietly in 2020 that most people inside the palace did not know existed, she decided who deserved her trust. She decided who understood what the monarchy actually was beneath its ceremonial surface, who grasped that it was not a brand to be monetized or a heritage asset to be packaged for luxury investors, who understood that its survival across centuries had depended not on its visibility, but on its integrity. She decided it was William, and she built something permanent around that decision. That is the story underneath this story, not the fury, not the failed plans, not the legal mechanisms or the financial scope of what transferred. The story is a queen who saw everything clearly, who trusted one person with her most private truth, and who made absolutely certain, with the last reserves of her considerable institutional intelligence, that no one could take it away from him. Drop a comment and tell us, do you think the Queen made the right call? And do you think Camilla will ever truly accept what Elizabeth decided? Because inside the palace right now, that question does not have a clean answer, and something tells us it will not for a very long time. Queen Elizabeth II said almost nothing in her final years about who she trusted most. She did not need to. The covenant she built in silence, the estate she passed in secret, and the man she chose to carry it all forward spoke louder than any public declaration ever could. William has it now, and Elizabeth made certain no one can take it from him.